$600 plus GST is a reduced fee that we're doing for the expo as well. So come over to the stand, register your details. You'll get a copy of the slides, and we'll also send out our new 1,000 Assets 2022 report, which has those 7 years of data trends. And we've got a giant bottle of champagne as well. So what could go wrong? Thank you very much, everyone, for having me. Any questions, I'll be over at the stand as well.
This is about depreciation legislation changes, and I'm going to introduce you to Mike Mortlock. Come on board. Thank you very much. He's the Managing Director of MCG Quantity Surveyors. I'm going to hand you over to the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for coming along. So, tax depreciation legislation hasn't really changed much since the 9th of May 2017, but property investor behaviour has certainly changed as a result of that. And what I want to share today is 7 years worth of investor trends. So we've got some really interesting data that not really any other industry is collecting. So starting off with who I am, I'm Mike from MCG Quantity Surveyors. I'm the Managing Director. MCG have been in the game for about 11 years. We've just won the Client Choice Award for Quantity Surveyors in the last couple of years. So what do they call that? A humble brag, I suppose. So what we're going to cover here is our data that we're collecting in the course of doing a depreciation schedule. So things like how big the property is, how much people are spending on renovations. These are all things that we collect that, you know, the ABS and CoreLogic and people like that don't have. So we're going to cover off what investors are buying. We're going to look at how far people are actually investing from where they live. We're going to look at some case studies and some specific legislation changes that I think accountants need to know about. And the quickest way to educate your clients on whether a report is worthwhile. So Einstein sort of said, you don't understand something if you can't explain it quickly and easily. So I've had my go at that. So hopefully that will help you. And we'll talk about the story of missed deductions in Australia as well. The ATO are here, and hello to them. But there's $2.88 billion worth of missed tax depreciation deductions out there, and we kind of want to take that away from them. We're going to talk about the key mistakes that property investors and quantity surveyors even and accountants are making. So how has property investor changed? So investors are buying much less brand new property. So we saw those numbers peak at around about 49.5% of investors are actually either buying or building brand new property. So 49.6 it peaked at in 2019, and it's come back to 16.24% of people. So you might remember on the 9th of May 2017, they changed the rules on the plant and equipment deductions. So you needed to be buying a brand new property or installing those assets brand new to claim those deductions. And we kind of thought, well, that's leading people to brand new property, right? That's where the depreciation incentives are. Investors buying a new dwelling have obviously decreased over those 5 years. People are buying much more houses than units. So houses are representing 60% of the purchases. So that's up 18% in 12 months. Units are only 23% of purchases. So we certainly saw units become very popular in the run up to sort of 17 and 18. Of course, during the pandemic, there's been some issues with vacancies, like the vacancy rate is very low across the country, but units are the ones that have been the most exposed. And we've also had some issues with the Mascot Towers and the Opal Towers. So there's been some bad press about units. So investors are picking up less of them. In terms of how much investors are actually paying for their investment property, we've found the figure to be $702,684. So that's a 26% increase on 5 years ago. So you can see there the average house price at just over $730, average unit price at over $700, and townhouses at $537. So that's quite a high amount for units. So that's really telling the story is that the typical investment unit is no longer that one bedroom sort of a student accommodation. People are spending a little bit more. They're looking for larger properties that apply, I guess they interest owner-occupiers as well as tenants, as investors. So how far do people actually buy from where they live? So we calculated this back in January 2020, and we saw that the average distance was actually 294 kilometres. So that's the distance from where people actually physically live and where they buy their investment property. I really wanted to have a look at that and see what the pandemic has done to those numbers. So we actually found that that's increased to 559 kilometres. It's the distance from where people live to where they invest. And I think it kind of challenges that notion that people sort of buy around the street because they're familiar with the market. There's certainly people that do that. There's certainly people that we see around about 10% of people are buying, within a couple of kilometres of where they live. But with buyers agents coming into the space, we've got a few here today. They're obviously allowing investors to look at Australia as a place to invest, rather than having to go to the open houses themselves in the local area. You can really invest across Australia. Which states people are investing in? Queensland has been the most popular investment destination for the depreciation schedules we've done for investors. So 37.44% of people have bought in Queensland. New South Wales was a little bit less than that, into the 20s. And Victoria just 11%. And I think part of that has to do with the pandemic as well. So the Victorians suffered much more really than any other state with lockdown. And when we're all kind of stuck at home, we aspire to say somewhere warm that's a little bit more open and free. And the price point is hard to ignore as well. So the median house price in Brisbane is just under $800,000. It's over $1 million in Canberra and Sydney and Melbourne, of course, as well. So investments in Queensland are proving very popular. When it comes to renovations, we obviously have a look at the depreciation schedule and we say, are you planning on making any improvements to the property? And we'll get that cost information. We're looking at improvements that the previous owner's done as well. Construction costs have, of course, risen. We've seen a number of builders go bankrupt. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a little bit of a panic to try and lock in a pipeline of work. So builders were signing up to work at low margins. And then, of course, the construction costs rise. We're seeing things like timber frame going up 75% in 12 months. That's really exposed a few people. So the average amount that people are spending is $29,000 on renovations, and that's up reasonably significantly in the last 12 months and up 28% over 5 years. We do sort of separate that data in terms of people that have occupied their property first, or people that have always used the property as an investment property, and they roughly spend about double if it's an owner-occ in the beginning. So when it comes to educating your clients on tax depreciation, we see accountants as really kind of like the real backstop. So you're the people that are doing the tax return and saying, have you got a tax depreciation schedule? And they normally say, no, what is that? But what we actually look at is the time it takes from when someone purchases a property to when they actually come to us and engage us to prepare a tax depreciation schedule. So you'll be familiar with the fact that you can backclaim 2 financial years worth of data. So we want to, of course, make sure people are doing that. But that $2.88 billion worth of missed deductions comes from our data analysis, where we looked at 1,000 residential tax depreciation schedules, and 6.4% of people actually waited more than 2 years to get in touch with us. And on average, they lost $20,537 worth of tax deductions. So that could really easily be $7,000 or $8,000 gone from their pocket. So when it comes to educating the clients, we came up with the 3 triggers. This is really our kind of simple way to explain whether your property would have a worthwhile depreciation deduction attached to it. Number 1 is the property is bought brand new. That's an obvious one because you get all the plant and equipment items. It's an undeducted asset, so it's brand new. We're not talking about a residual value. And of course, you're getting all the plant and equipment, the structural components as well. Point number 2 is it's got to be built after the cut-off date for depreciation on the original structure. So if it qualifies for original Division 43, 16th of September 1987. So it's brand new, it's built after 87. We don't really need to know much more about the property to know that it's worthwhile. The other one, in point 3, which I think is actually quite crucial, is if the property's built prior to 1987, we do hear from people that are told that, okay, it's built pre-1987, the original structure doesn't qualify, so there's no real deductions available to it. The huge caveat is that if the property has been renovated, you can claim depreciation deductions, either if you're doing the renovation yourself, but if the previous owner has done it as well. So if you think about properties that are built pre-87, let's say they're in the 70s or the 60s, it doesn't make a lot of financial sense to leave that property unrenovated, because if you're trying to redraw value from that, pull out the equity, it's kind of it's stealing from it a little bit if it's not up to date. The quality of the tenant is going to be different, and of course the rental yield. So there's a lot of reasons why investors would be improving the property. So that's a really important one. And just to sort of ram that point home, I wanted to show a couple of case studies. So here's a property from Tagady in Victoria. So it was built prior to 1987, but it had $314,000 worth of renovations in the property. You probably can't see that terribly well from the outside, but none done by the actual investor purchaser. So all of those works done by the previous owner, those blood, sweat and tears. The beneficiary of that is that investor purchaser who bought that. So over $190,000 worth of residual value in the deductions, and the first year claim of just under $8,000 worth of deductions. So when people sort of say, you know, the property's built in the 70s, there's no deductions available, here's a good example of where that's not the case. Here's another one as well. So a property in Toronto near the lake in New South Wales, built in prior to 1987, and it only had just under $38,000 worth of prior renovations, but the client has done some significant works for that as well. So the first year claim, $11,000 worth of deductions. This one here in orange, again, built not that far before 1987, but $185,000 spent and some paint and carpet by the client as well. So over the life of the property, $90,000 worth of residual deductions, and we're talking $5,783 worth of deductions back in their pocket. Not back in their pocket, depends on their marginal rate, but you know, nearly $6,000 worth of deductions, you know, could easily be $1,800, $2,000 back in their pocket. So that's a bit of a crusade that we're on, is to get people to understand that just because it's not brand new, yes, the legislation changed in 2017 and it's better to have a new property because of the plant and equipment deductions, it doesn't mean that older properties aren't going to be worthwhile. Here's a commercial example as well. So the cut-off date for depreciation deductions on the structure is different for commercial depending on what type it is. This one's a little warehouse retail. So it had $181,000 spent on it. It was built in the 50s or 60s from memory, and we're talking $10,000 worth of deductions in the first year. So a pretty good result for that client. So on the 9th of May 2017, obviously that's when our esteemed Prime Minister was the then Treasurer. We didn't have any sort of advance notice that they were going to change those plant and equipment rules, but it has had an impact on the deductions. So prior to the change, we found that the average depreciation deductions we get across residential property was $9,415. After that, it was $6,178 for properties that are affected by the change. So obviously there's brand new properties that aren't affected by that May change. So if that is applicable, you can see the deductions have dropped a little bit, but it's not so significant that depreciation is still not an important conversation that you need to have with your client. This financial year to date, we found 69.62% of investors were impacted by those budget changes. So the average deductions which we've crunched from 1 July through to last week was $8,974. So that's our average residential depreciation deductions. This is really the data metric that kind of started us on this sort of data crusade. And if you go to our stand, we've just actually released our 1,000 Assets report for 2022, which has 7 years worth of property investor data trends, everything from house sizes to renovation, all sorts of different bits of metric that I think will be of interest to you. When we started the business, quantity surveyors were saying, you know, on average we get between $5,000 and $10,000. I didn't really like that. First of all, it's not an average, right? So we wanted to crunch the exact figure, and I remember that to be $9,183 because I was very excited with it. So it's dropped a little bit. It changes actually every day. We have a television in the office where it's kind of live, but around that $9,000 mark is where it sits. And over the life of a residential property, it's about $230,000. You can see the deductions there for houses. Units tend to be a little bit more just because of the common area entitlements as well. And townhouses, sort of a little bit of a middle ground. And townhouses are certainly very popular as an investment type. Granny flats, obviously, they tend to be brand new, so there's some great deductions available to them as well. And a lot of people are investing in duplex for the cash flow as well. The legislation change on the 9th of May 2017 is probably the biggest one that we've seen for a while, but in 2019, the ATO effective lives did change, and they change every year, but it's really the first year since about 2005 that residential effective lives changed. Now, quantity surveyors were consulted and we got very, very excited. So lots of people were sort of saying, oh yes, well, plant and equipment, we should have water tanks in there, for example. But what's kind of interesting about that is if you take it from a Division 43 asset to a plant and equipment item, there's no actual deductions on it if it's a one-year-old asset, right? Because of those changes, if you're buying a brand new property with a water tank, you can now claim it as plant and equipment. If you're buying a property that's 1 year old, there's actually no claim because it used to be part of the structure and you would at least get 2.5% of it. But these days you're actually getting nothing from that. So it really comes down to what shifted from Division 40 plant and equipment to Division 43, and there were a few things. So the water tank, for example, has a 15-year effective life, and you can get 13.3% of it if you're buying it brand new. But if it's an established property and it's 1 year old or 10 years old, you're actually not going to get anything. So $333 as a plant and equipment item, or $62.50 if it was Division 43. So that is kind of an interesting nuance where the legislation change for plant and equipment has actually kind of cost investors when things go into plant and equipment. So water tanks were the big one, hydronic heaters, home automation, skylight controls. My personal favourite, digital peepholes were added to residential effective lives. Why do I like that? It just kind of sounds creepy. Essentially, it's an intercom. They could have said intercom, but digital peephole, I don't know, the ATO, they're a bit weird. I had to say them again. So key mistakes accountants, property investors are making. New property is not affected by that plant and equipment change is actually not technically 100% correct. If you buy a brand new property as an investor and you move into it for a year and then rent it out, you'll actually kill off the plant and equipment deductions. So once it becomes your place of residence, that's the last day you'll actually be able to claim those plant and equipment. Where in the old rules, you could move in and out, you'd still get those deductions. So it applies to all residential property. So if it's new, you've got to be careful with occupying it. So if you purchase new after the 9th of May, you need to make sure that you're not in that property. You can go and stay overnight to renovate it, but you can't sort of be in there longer than that. Repairs and maintenance is obviously a big one for the ATO. There's a lot of crypto people here this year, so there'll be lots of crypto stuff the ATO is looking at. But repairs and maintenance are a key one. We're about to release a tax time checklist that has a flow chart to help investors understand what's a repair and what's maintenance as well. So we're over at the standard EO6, I think it is. Holiday homes and incidental use is the same sort of issue that we were talking about, occupying the property. So if you buy a brand new holiday home and you say, send your mother there to stay for a week, what you really need to do is charge her rent. Now that sounds awful, Mother's Day's coming up. But what you actually should be doing is charging her rent and then buying her a present to the equivalent value, right? Because if you or your family are using this property and it's a brand new asset and you have the plant equipment deductions, you will kill them if you occupy the property. So people need to be very careful with that. If an investor buys an established property that's just had a renovation, we get this question a lot. People are sort of saying, well, I bought this property and it's just been gutted, completely redone by the previous owner. You can't claim those assets as brand new assets because you didn't hold the asset as at the time that it was installed, and you weren't the first user of that. Now, there are sort of some nuances to that if it's considered brand new property, but then you'll be applicable to GST, but that's something that that people definitely make as a mistake. With developers, there is a provision to say that they can sell a property with a tenant in place, but really that needs to be sold within 6 months. So you can still claim that as a brand new property if there's a tenant in there, but you have to really buy it within 6 months. I will rip through these slides a little bit, but we'll have a copy of them at our stand as well. So the good news is the vast majority of schedules still have a Division 43 claim, and hopefully those case studies sort of show you that older properties still have some good bang for buck deductions wise. We do homework for accountants free, so it's a matter of flicking us an email with the address of the property and we'll do a free estimate of that. And it's still something that's being missed. So we see that as a huge advantage to accountants, and certainly we work with accountants that do free tax reviews, and depreciation is part of it. And if that's been missed, that can make a huge difference. I'm going to go through this a little bit quicker. $600 plus GST is a reduced fee that we're doing for the expo as well. So come over to the stand, register your details. You'll get a copy of the slides, and we'll also send out our new 1,000 Assets 2022 report, which has those 7 years of data trends. And we've got a giant bottle of champagne as well. So what could go wrong? Thank you very much, everyone, for having me. Any questions, I'll be over at the stand as well. Cheers. Thank you.
For more information, visit our website at mcgqs.com.au.